I think, in short, the U.S. and China are on something of a collision course. I don't mean in a military sense necessarily, but at least diplomatically.
We'll have more of that conversation coming up later in the podcast. From Seoul, South Korea, you're listening to Asian News Weekly. Abe's electoral outcome, a big win for North Korea, and where does China go from here? These stories and more are on the December 19th edition of Asian News Weekly. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's show. It began sometime before 8 a.m. Monday morning when a perpetrator took hostages at the Lindt Chocolate Cafe located in Sydney's Martin Place. At 8:47 a.m. local time, a picture was posted to Twitter of two hostages holding up a black flag with Arabic text. Witnesses in the area heard loud bangs that sounded like gunshots. Patrick Byrne, a producer at Channel 7, whose newsroom was opposite the cafe, said, quote, "We raced to the window and saw the shocking and chilling sight of people putting their hands up against the panes of glass at the cafe." End quote. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. Consulate General Sydney warned American citizens to avoid the area and then was evacuated. Several other financial institutions locked down their offices as well for safety. Throughout the day, speculation flew across the news feeds about how many hostages there were, how many gunmen were there, and was this the work of ISIS? Zain Ali, the head of the Islamic Studies Research Unit at the University of Auckland, told the Associated Press the flag was difficult to read, and what was shown was incomplete. He felt the word that was depicted was shahada, or a declaration of faith. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Wording and its stylization have been used by militant groups around the world like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Muslim groups quickly released a statement condemning the standoff, in part saying, quote, "The Australian Muslim community shares with fellow Sydneysiders their utter shock and horror at the unprecedented scenes emerging from the Lindt Cafe in Martin Place this morning. We reject any attempt to take the innocent life of any human being." End quote. By the afternoon, 2 hostages had fled the cafe, but exactly under what circumstances wasn't known. The hostages did speak to reporters and told them a gunman in the cafe wanted to speak to Prime Minister Tony Abbott and for an Islamic State flag to be delivered to the cafe. One of the hostages that later escaped was barista Ellie Chen, whose sister Nicole said on Facebook, quote, "Yes, I finally see you. I'm so glad you're safe." End quote. As evening fell, it was revealed the person responsible for the situation had contacted various media outlets and spoken with police. It was also revealed the 5 who had fled the cafe did so by escaping and were not let go. News 7 reported that there were 15 hostages, but that number did not come from authorities. A Lindt executive said that there were about 10 staff members and probably up to 30 customers at that time of the morning inside the cafe. New South Wales Police Commissioner Andrew Sipony indicated a huge security operation was underway, saying, quote, "We are at this stage continuing to secure and make sure that we are doing all that we can to bring this to a peaceful outcome. We want this matter resolved peacefully, and we will do all we need to ensure that." End quote. In the wee hours Tuesday morning, police stormed the Lindt Cafe in Sydney. While that action did put an end to 16 hours of the hostage crisis, it also came with a sacrifice. Tori Johnson, the 34-year-old manager of the Lindt Chocolate Cafe, and 38-year-old barrister and mother of 3 Katrina Dawson, perished in an exchange of gunfire. Archbishop Anthony Fisher spoke of how the heart of our city is broken by the deaths of 2 innocents during a prayer service held that day. Reportedly, Tori Johnson saw an opportunity during the standoff and attempted to seize the gun held by the perpetrator, but it went off and killed him. However, that distraction gave the police the opening they needed to move in. Katrina Dawson was said to have shielded her pregnant friend from gunfire. These heroes were willing to lay down their lives so that others might live, said New South Wales Deputy Police Commissioner Catherine Byrne. She also went on to say that she could not elaborate on specifics of the operation, as an investigation was still underway. However, Commissioner Sipony said, quote, "It was the act of an individual, They should never destroy or change the way of our life." End quote. Man Haron Monis, an Iranian-born refugee and self-styled sheikh, was responsible for the hostage situation. Officials have released information about Monis, and that he has been charged with more than 40 counts of sexual assault and found guilty in 2012 of sending offensive and threatening letters to the families of 8 Australian soldiers killed overseas. Quote, "This is a one-off random individual. It's not a concerted terrorism event or act. It's a damaged goods individual who's done something outrageous," end quote. And that statement was from his former lawyer, Manny Condisis. Throughout the day, people were genuinely concerned for their safety, wondering if reports were valid when it was disclosed that bombs had been planted elsewhere in the city. But others were also treating it as a spectacle. Reporters from BuzzFeed and the BBC noted individuals going down to the scene to take selfies and such. When the pictures were posted, they were harshly criticized, and rightly so. On a positive note, the I'll Ride With You program garnered positive traction. It's a program where Australians volunteer to ride public transportation with members of the Muslim community to fight intimidation. With events like this, it's very important to remember that a single individual does not represent a nation or a religion. In just a few minutes, how North Korea hacked its way to a win. This past Sunday, Japan went to the polls to select new members of the lower house of the Diet in a snap election called by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Michael Chuchek, adjunct fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan, joins me now to go over the results. Mr. Chuchek, welcome back to the podcast.
It's nice to be back.
So we expected a huge landslide for the LDP, and, well, we know now that Mr. Abe did get it, but what exactly are the numbers?
Mr. Abe came into the election with 295 seats, or 293, depending on the way you count it, and walked out with 291. Considering that the economy is in a recession, and that a lot of his policies are really unpopular, that loss of seats is trivial. And his coalition partner, the new Komeito, gained a few seats, so that basically the coalition is basically where it was before the election. So if you wanted to say, this has been a referendum on my rule, and look, my coalition has 2/3 of the seats in the House of Representatives, we're right back where we were, the people are happy.
Well, I mean, some people said that this was more or less a vote of no confidence for the other parties, that there really wasn't a good alternative. Is that what you saw in looking at these results?
That's basically true. The other parties didn't have enough candidates in the district seats, so that often the LDP member was running only against the nominal opposition of a Communist Party candidate. And in the proportional seats, the LDP didn't do as well in terms of party support, but the other parties didn't do particularly great, or at least the main opposition parties, the centrist ones. However, the communists did fantastically, nearly doubling their percentage of the vote and more than doubling their representation in the Diet. So for the opposition, it's a mixed bag. But certainly, if people were hoping that they'd be able to make a statement through their votes to slow down restarts of nuclear power plants, to slow down action on revision of the Constitution, to slow down the way that Abenomics, this package of different kinds of policies that are supposed to stimulate the economy, but so far has not done as well as expected. All these things, if they wanted to put a brake on that, well, they did not succeed in doing that.
What about the Democratic Party of Japan? How well did they fare in the election?
The DPJ, the main opposition party that was the ruling party from 2009 and 2012, didn't do terribly. It didn't lose any seats, but it gained only a few, only 10 seats. And that's out of the remainders of several parties that simply broke up before the election even took place. So even in picking up the pieces, they didn't get a very big turnout in terms of what they could have picked up. They had a problem. They were led by an extremely uninspiring leader, and a man basically with a black tongue. Anything he talked about, you just would just be suddenly become the most aggravating thing in your life. He could not stimulate people to vote for the party. He could not convince potential candidates to run as DPJ candidates. And so the party was frozen and went into this election completely disorganized, without any plan to fight an election and no ability to scramble. So in terms of opposing the LDP, providing a wall on which the LDP can toss something and it bounces back, no, they didn't do that.
If we take a look at voter turnout, the numbers, well, they were quite low. Is this a good indicator of the overall support for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's policies?
The electoral system of Japan is designed to return the LDP to power, and that systemic strength is only magnified when there's low turnout. This election, however, was the lowest turnout on record and seriously below the previous record low turnout. Abe came into office on what had been the lowest voter turnout in history. Under his 2 years of rule, the people have become more demoralized. People have become less involved politically, more despairing, and only 52% showed up to vote in this election. And that is going to be hanging over Abe. Of course, he won, but there's going to be a stigma, a black cloud that's going to hang over this win.
Michael Chuchek is an adjunct fellow at the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Not at all.
What's the future of Hong Kong after the Umbrella Revolution? That's coming up after this. It is, without a doubt, the most devastating computer hack to date. I, of course, am speaking about the assault on Sony by the so-called Guardians of Peace. How the hackers got into Sony's network isn't fully understood, and it may actually take some time before it is, but one thing is clear. The attack showed a level of sophistication taken right from the pages of the best espionage novels. The United States and others believe that North Korea is behind the hack, as it has all of their hallmarks. The DPRK has come out in support of the digital intrusion, but denied any responsibility, something it has done repeatedly when it attacks systems in South Korea. But the news this week isn't necessarily about the hack itself, but how it translates into a win for North Korea. It's suspected that all of this is in response to the planned release of the Seth Rogen and James Franco lowbrow comedy The Interview. North Korea cried foul when it was announced, and now has succeeded in getting Sony to pull the film from U.S. theaters. The hackers posted online a very poorly worded threat, recalling images of the September 11th attacks, and warned theaters and moviegoers of doom and gloom. Sony gave theaters the option to opt out of showing the film, as a precautionary measure, even though the United States said there was no credible intelligence indicating an attack. And all of them did so. Every single theater. With no theater willing to show the film, Sony was left with no choice but to pull the film, which is exactly what the DPRK wanted. This marks a dark day when corporations bow. No, strike that. When corporations cower to the whims of hackers. The leaked information from the Guardians of Peace, which is surely some sort of DPRK-affiliated unit in China, pales in comparison to the takeaway from this situation. This event has shown digital warriors have the ability to affect change in the real world. We're all, unfortunately, familiar with conventional warfare, and in this instance, Sony is the first casualty as dawn breaks on the era of digital terrorism. And unfortunately, this incident has already claimed a second victim, Steve Carell, whose film Pyongyang, while only in development, has already been shelved. The United States and Sony were once powerhouses, but now they've been kicked to the ground by the new bully in the sandbox, North Korea. More from the region after this with a weekly brief. Police cleared the final pro-democracy encampment Monday located in Hong Kong's Causeway Bay. Reports say that less than 20 staunch supporters of the Umbrella Revolution staged a sit-in as police took down the barricades. It is a number indicative of the waned support the movement has after an extended period of time in the streets. Now, that isn't to say that Hong Kongers have given up on the fight for democracy, but have rather come to the realization that the street protests are over. But what's next? Sure, Beijing has won the round, but as Bruce Loy said in our December 10th Asian Now podcast, Hong Kong residents still want universal suffrage. With students vowing to continue their pursuit of democratic reform, what exactly will Beijing do? I asked Scott Harold, political scientist with the RAND Corporation, since much of the protests were galvanized by students, what must the Hong Kong government and Beijing do in turn to turn things around and win back support from younger generations?
Well, there are easy answers, I suppose, and then there are more realistic ones. The easier answers would be to try to address substantively concerns and considerations that brought, at times, dozens or hundreds, and at other times, thousands and tens of thousands of people into the street. Those being, first and foremost, the sense that Hong Kongers were being deprived of their legitimate right to play a role in their own governance in a way that was not being pre-screened by Beijing. I suspect that Beijing's shown quite clearly that that's something they're not prepared to do out of consideration or concerns that might slip beyond their control, or that their equities and interests in Hong Kong might not be adequately protected by someone who's not pre-approved by Beijing. And so I suspect laterally what we're more likely to see is a substantial period of kind of, whether you want to call it cooling off or, waiting for people's memories of the immediate passions of the last several weeks and months to fade, seems to me to be kind of where Beijing is going to take this now. We're also seeing, however, that there are efforts being pushed by the government of Hong Kong, presumably at the sponsorship of Beijing, to try to really associate some penalties or costs with those people who were deemed to be leaders in these protests. And I think that's an area where, to the extent that the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government at a higher level decide that there's going to be some payback, that's really going to keep this as an ongoing issue. It's not going to heal in any way. And in fact, it could lead to further tensions. So right now, I think there's probably going to have to be some pretty serious thinking in both Hong Kong and Beijing about how to approach this question in a way that doesn't lead to a recrudescence of the movement. And for the leaders of the movement and the people who are involved in it, I think there's going to be some pretty serious thought that goes into, what's the next step? Is the next step a long-term process of trying to build a more democratic Hong Kong through education and social organizing and civil society? Is it a return to street protests? Is it something else? And I think right now there are many different views in that camp, but the one thing that all of them seem to have agreed upon is that the costs of departing from popular support, in other words, of taking the movement and turning it into something that may adopt methods that the broadest mass of Hong Kong people are not willing to be associated with, may be too high. The movement got its greatest support when it was seen to be peaceful, when it was seen to be assaulted by either thugs or Hong Kong police, and that was what really generated a lot of support. I do think that the movement stayed on so long, in part because of the determination of the people that in Hong Kong, that the goals that they were seeking were just. However, I do think at a certain point it began to wear on the support levels, and I think that was pretty evident at the end.
When the handoff occurred in 1997 between China and the United Kingdom, we saw some individuals opt to leave. Is that likely to happen here?
Well, it's certainly possible that a lot of the younger supporters of the umbrella movement could find that their futures in Hong Kong do not look as appealing. And in fact, I think that highlights one aspect of these protests, which is that while they were directly about Hong Kong people governing Hong Kong, they also have a very strong overlay because Beijing has so closely associated itself with the tycoons and the power elite in Hong Kong at the expense of the common people, which means that a lot of young people find that their future in Hong Kong looks rather bleak. They will not be able to buy a home until they're in their late 40s or early 50s. They won't be able to afford a very good quality of life. They may have a hard time finding jobs. So in theory, they could leave Hong Kong. On the other hand, I think what a big part of these movements has been building a greater and more cohesive sense of a common Hong Kong identity. And for that reason, it would not surprise me if many of these individuals choose to stay and continue their struggles to build what they would deem a better Hong Kong that they want to live in and they want to stay in. I did not hear many people in my 4.5 years in Hong Kong who were active politically talking about wanting to leave Hong Kong. Now, it's certainly possible if there's an awful lot of penalties associated with public activism, if the Chinese government or its Hong Kong proxies decide to really go after people who are involved in this, they could certainly drive people from Hong Kong. But that would really, in many ways, entail some pretty substantial cost to their own equities in Hong Kong if there's a sense that Beijing and the Hong Kong government have decided that you can't really engage in even limited legal protests in Hong Kong.
Turning our attention to the South China Sea, December 15th has come and gone, and China, as expected, didn't respond to the matter before it and the International Tribunal regarding competing claims with the Philippines. The U.S. has now come out and said that they feel there is no legal basis for the so-called 9-dash line, and I wanted to get your opinion. What does this mean for the region, for the United States, for ASEAN in 2015?
I'll be speculating here, but I would say that the U.S. has made fairly clear and increasingly clear that it regards the ultimate resolution of the disagreements between the parties to the disputes in the South China Sea over claims, and some of those claims are territorial claims, some of them may be maritime EEZ claims or claims about access. That it regards itself as having a very strong interest in those, in part because of the implications of China's expansive claims and because of China's approach to what it believes it can do in terms of blocking other powers and other states from EEZ waters, from undertaking certain kinds of activities in EEZ waters. I think, in short, the U.S. and China are on something of a collision course. I don't mean in a military sense necessarily, but at least diplomatically over this issue. There's a pretty clear disagreement between China and almost all of its neighbors, as well as the United States and other powers on this issue, including powers who are further afield, not just Japan or Korea or Australia, but also countries like India or even states in Europe. And I think trying to find a way to resolve this disagreement over access rights, over actual physical control, it's quite difficult to see how this happens, but I suspect that in the coming year, the U.S. is going to continue to call on China to respect arbitration and to proceed with arbitration. And China's perspective has traditionally been that there's no real role for arbitration here, and certainly not a multilateral one. As long as the two sides hold those fairly directly contradictory positions, I would expect that this issue could conceivably heat up in terms of its implications for overall strategic trust or the strategic relationship over the coming year.
Scott Harold is a political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely, Steve. I'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Do you agree with Scott? How will Beijing address the deep-rooted desire for democracy in Hong Kong? What about the South China Sea? Do you think we'll see more confrontations in the next year? Please share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. And don't miss our Asia Now podcast. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on the podcast, I spoke with Steve Cheng, who explained the inner workings of the Shanghai-Hong Kong Stock Connect and why it may not be the hottest ticket in the region.
It has been another busy week in Asia. What has been happening? I'm Michael Farrell with the Weekly Brief. A U.S. Marine was charged on Monday with the murder of a transgendered woman in the Philippines. The Marine in question is Private First Class Scott Pemberton, a native of Massachusetts. He is accused of killing Jennifer Laud, who was formerly known as Jeffrey. According to witnesses, Pemberton was with Laud at a local disco before checking into an Olongapo hotel together the night of October 11th. The next day, Laud's naked body was found with her head in a toilet. There was some debate over Pemberton's custody, but to ease the issue, he remains in U.S. custody, but in a Filipino military camp in Manila. Did you know that Angelina Jolie directs movies? I'm no movie buff, but I sure didn't. And some Japanese are probably wishing that she had stuck to acting. Her latest movie, Unbroken, has not yet been released. But still, the movie isn't being well received in Japan. The movie is an adaptation of a book by Laura Hillenbrand. It tells the story of real-life Olympian Louis Zamperini as he struggles to survive being shot down in the Pacific and then captured by the Japanese during World War II. It sounds like a lot of fun to watch, but already a wave of outrage has been inspired in Japan by the movie trailers and historical claims made in the book. In particular, people are upset about a claim in the book that the Japanese ate their prisoners of war. Mutsuhiro Takeuchi is a Shinto priest and a nationalist-leaning educator. On this matter, he told the AP, quote, "There was absolutely no cannibalism. That is not our custom," unquote. With the arrests of high-level generals and government officials in China these days, the Chinese have really been clamping down on government corruption. And as part of their continuing efforts to stamp out corruption, they have reassigned 1,000 quote-unquote naked officials. Far from showing up at work in their birthday suits, though, these naked officials are those whose family members have migrated overseas. New regulations established in China back in January say that officials whose spouse and children live overseas can't be promoted. They also can't hold any high-level positions. The official reasoning for these limitations is the belief that it is much easier to hide money overseas if you have family living abroad. However, in a country that frequently abuses free speech and ethnic civil rights, one can also see this as an attempt to control the flow of information and limit foreign influences on the government. Lastly, all you English teachers out there, take note. A former English teacher is now the wealthiest man in all of Asia. I'm serious. Jack Ma, the guy who founded e-commerce behemoth Alibaba, was a former English teacher. And according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, he now has a net worth of $28.6 billion. He just edged out former top rich guy, the Hong Kong property and port tycoon Li Ka-shing. Ka-shing followed at a mere $28.3 billion. You can probably expect that gap to increase too. Alibaba has a $259 billion market, and it is larger than both Amazon and eBay combined. That's not bad for a company started by a former English teacher in his apartment in 1999.
All right, my friends. Well, the podcast is winding down, but before I go, let's take a quick look at some of your comments that you've sent in this week. Now, first up is one from Michael Peckett. Now, I asked people if they were looking forward to the Japanese election this past Sunday, and he responded by saying this: "Quite apathetic here. Whilst important to vote, the wife will abstain. Doesn't want LD, DPJ, or any others to be in charge." Anthony Murphy also shared his thoughts on America's most recent defector to North Korea. This kind of thing has happened on more than just this occasion recently. It makes me wonder if something else isn't going on beneath the surface. Spy work, for example. Suppose a spy gets found out. Death would surely follow swiftly, unless you denounce your former government and become an international public figure by doing so. This puts the DPRK in an awkward position, since if they kill you, they've then murdered a public figure, and one who has denounced a state enemy, no less. Of course, I am most likely just wildly speculating here, but you may never know with the way we do things around the world these days. Most likely, the man is seriously mentally ill. And finally, Cheryl Wevel sent this message in via Twitter after hearing about our Asia Brief story on the grisly Malaysian murders. Horrified at what the world is coming to. Thanks again for sending in those comments. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you'll take a moment to share your thoughts on the stories that we covered this week. You can do so either in the comment section on Facebook or Twitter. Now, if you haven't found us yet on social media, those addresses are facebook.com/Asian News Weekly or, of course, at Asian News Weekly on Twitter. You can even send an email into the show with your questions, your feedback, or even your audio comments. Just drop a line to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. And if you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll share it with your friends. If you'd like to subscribe to this and other podcasts, just visit our website. You can click on the big subscribe tab at the top of the page or those big iTunes and Stitcher buttons. Subscribing is free, and when you do, that next episode is delivered automatically to you. If you'd like more information on any of the stories we covered this week, just check out the show notes on our website. And one final note, since Christmas is next week, I'll be starting my winter vacation just a little bit early, so this will be the last Asian News Weekly for 2014. I'd really like to thank you for all the support you've given me over the past 9 months. I really couldn't do it without you, so thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Asian News Weekly will return in February of 2015, so until then, I hope you have an absolutely amazing holiday season. And for Asian News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asian News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.